The doors of the training hall slammed shut before I even sat down, and every claw in the room turned toward the sound. Something had gone wrong. I could feel it in the way the air changed, thick and sharp, the way it always did before a fight. But there was no fight. Not yet. There was only silence, and the silence was worse. My name is Corwin. I am not human. I come from a world called Threxa, where the sky is the color of rust, and the ground never forgets a footprint. On my world, strength is not a virtue. It is the only law. A person who cannot prove their strength does not rise. They do not lead. They barely survive. This is not cruelty. It is simply how we were built, generation after generation, until it became instinct instead of choice. I am telling you this because you need to understand what kind of room I was sitting in, and what kind of world had raised the students around me, before I tell you what the human girl did. We were in our 3rd year at the Interstellar Academy of Xenobiology and Survival Studies, a school built on a neutral station between 6 star systems, where the sons and daughters of 100 different worlds came to learn how to master the wild things their ancestors had once feared. It was, in theory, a school about respect for nature. In practice, it was a school about conquest. Every species there had its own version of the same lesson. If you can control a dangerous creature, you have proven that you deserve your place among the strong. That was the assignment on the board that morning, written in the professor's steady, unbothered handwriting. Bring a beast from your home planet. Demonstrate control. Explain your method. I remember staring at those words for a long time. Not because they were new. Every student at the academy had known this assignment was coming since the semester began. We had talked about it in the dining hall, in the sleeping quarters, in the long quiet hours between classes. Everyone had a plan. Everyone had already decided which creature they would bring, which chains they would use, which cage would look most impressive when they carried it through the door. Everyone except her. Her name was Alice Turner, and she was the only human in our entire year. She had arrived halfway through the first term, quiet and small compared to the rest of us, with pale skin and light brown hair pulled back in a simple braid. She did not carry weapons. She did not boast. She barely spoke unless someone spoke to her first, and even then, her answers were short, careful, thoughtful. I did not understand her, not at first. On Threxa, silence is often a sign of weakness, a sign that a person has nothing worth saying because they have nothing worth proving. But Alice's silence did not feel weak. It felt like she was simply choosing not to waste words. There is a difference, though it took me a long time to see it. The other students had their own opinions about her. Dorian, a broad-shouldered boy from a world of endless deserts, liked to say that humans were soft creatures who had only survived this long because no one had bothered to test them properly. Elsie, from a colder world where ice never truly melted, thought humans were clever in a sly, quiet way, the way a small animal is clever when it cannot fight back and must think its way out of danger instead. Bastian thought she was simply lost, placed in the wrong class by some mistake in the admissions office. Freya did not think about her at all. I thought about her more than I wanted to admit. There was a day, weeks before the assignment was given, when our class studied predator behavior on a planet called Valdoon, home to a species of 6-legged hunters that killed in packs. The professor showed us footage of the hunt, the coordination, the discipline, the way the pack worked as a single mind with many bodies. Most of the students watched with hungry interest, already imagining themselves commanding such a pack, forcing it to bend to their will. Alice watched with something else in her eyes. Not hunger, not fear either, something quieter. Afterward, she raised her hand and asked a question that made half the room turn to stare at her. She asked why the hunters trusted each other enough to hunt as a team instead of fighting each other for the kill. The professor, a tall, ancient being named Professor Holt, whose scales had turned silver with age, paused before answering. It was not the kind of question our class usually asked. We asked how to defeat a creature, how to break its will, how to prove dominance over it. We did not usually ask how a creature learned to trust. Professor Holt said that trust, among wild things, is often the rarest and most fragile achievement in nature, harder to build than any cage, harder to break than any chain. I remember that Alice nodded slowly, as if she had already known the answer and only wanted to hear someone else say it aloud. I remember that Dorian rolled his eyes and muttered something about how trust was a luxury for creatures too weak to fight alone. I remember that I said nothing at all, but I did not forget the moment. It stayed with me the way a splinter stays under skin, small and forgotten until you press against it again. The day the assignment was given, the room buzzed with excitement the moment Professor Holt finished speaking. Every student began whispering to their neighbors about which beast they intended to bring. Dorian planned to capture a sandcrawler, an armored creature the size of a transport vehicle, known for burying travelers alive in collapsing dunes. Elsie planned to bring a frosthound, a pack hunter that could track prey across 100 miles of ice without ever losing the scent. Bastian, always eager to impress, said he intended to bring back a creature so dangerous that even naming it in class would be considered reckless. I planned to bring a stone serpent from the caverns beneath my home city, a creature so strong it could crush armored plating between its coils, and so old that our stories said it remembered the first Threxans who ever tried to tame it. Bringing one under control would mean something. It would mean I had earned a place among the strong ones of my world, not just among the strong ones of this school. Through all of this excitement, Alice sat quietly at her desk, not writing anything down, not joining any of the conversations happening around her. When Professor Holt asked if there were any questions before dismissing the class, most students shook their heads, already lost in their plans. Alice raised her hand. Professor Holt nodded toward her, and the room went quiet, the way it always did when the human spoke, half out of curiosity and half out of the quiet assumption that whatever she said would be strange or small or somehow wrong. She asked a single question, and it was not the question anyone expected. She asked, "Does the creature have to be afraid of me?" For a moment nobody spoke. Dorian let out a short laugh, quickly swallowed when Professor Holt's eyes moved toward him. Elsie tilted her head, studying Alice the way she might study an animal doing something unexpected. I found myself leaning forward slightly, waiting for the answer, though I could not have explained why the question mattered so much to me. Professor Holt studied Alice for a long moment before answering. The assignment does not require fear, it requires control. How you achieve that control is your own choice to make. Alice nodded once, thanked the professor, and gathered her things without another word. She walked out of the training hall calmly, leaving the rest of us behind with our excited whispers and our half-formed plans for conquest. I sat there long after the others had left, turning her question over in my mind. Does the creature have to be afraid of me? It was such a simple sentence, and yet it felt like it had cracked something open inside the room, something none of the rest of us had thought to ask. On Threxa, fear and respect are the same word. We do not separate them, because our ancestors never needed to. If something feared you, it obeyed you. If it obeyed you, you were strong. If you were strong, you deserved to lead. This chain of logic had held for 1,000 generations, unquestioned, unbroken, as solid as the mountains that ring our capital city. But Alice's question suggested that there might be another way to gain control over something wild, a way that did not require fear at all. I did not understand it yet. I am not certain I fully understood it even by the end of that year. But I remember walking back to my quarters that night with her words circling in my mind like a hunting bird that refuses to land, and I remember thinking, for the first time since I had arrived at this academy, that perhaps I did not know everything about strength that I believed I knew. The days leading up to the presentation passed quickly. Students disappeared for hours at a time, traveling back to their home systems to capture the creatures they had chosen, returning exhausted and triumphant, already boasting about the struggles they had survived. Dorian returned with a bruise across his jaw, and a story about how the sandcrawler had nearly buried him alive before he broke its will. Elsie returned with frostbite creeping up her fingers and a grim satisfaction in her eyes, describing how the frosthound had tested her for 3 days before finally submitting. Alice did not disappear at all. She remained on campus the entire week, attending her classes as usual, studying in the library during her free hours, eating alone in the corner of the dining hall with a small, distant look on her face, as if her mind was somewhere far away, even when her body sat among us. I asked her once, in passing, whether she had already captured her creature. It was the only real conversation we had before the day of the presentation. She looked up at me, and there was something calm and steady in her eyes that I had not expected. She said that she had not captured anything, and that she did not plan to. I did not understand what she meant by that. None of us did. We assumed, in our own separate ways, that she had simply failed to find a suitable creature, or that fear had finally caught up with her small, unarmed body, or that she had quietly given up on an assignment she never should have been given in the first place. We were wrong about all of it, though none of us would understand exactly how wrong until the day she finally walked through those training hall doors, carrying something that would silence every proud, boasting student in that room, myself included. But that story belongs to what came next. The morning of the presentation began with a kind of energy I had rarely felt inside the training hall. Students arrived early, dragging cages, leading chained creatures, carrying stunned or bound beasts across their shoulders, like trophies earned through hard-fought battles. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the strange mixture of scents that came from a dozen different worlds, all pressed into one room at once. Professor Holt stood at the front of the hall, arms folded behind their back, watching everything with the patient, unreadable expression of someone who had seen 100 years of students try to prove themselves in exactly this same way. Beside the professor stood a row of empty pens, built into the wall, ready to hold whatever creatures were about to be paraded through the door. Dorian arrived first, and the moment he entered, the whole room turned to look. Behind him, dragged on thick chains by two assistants, came the Sandcrawler, an armored beast the size of a small transport vehicle, its many legs scraping uselessly against the metal floor as it strained against its restraints. Its eyes, small and black, darted around the room with obvious panic, and every few seconds it let out a low, grinding sound that vibrated through the floor beneath our feet. Dorian stood tall beside his captured beast, chest out, chin lifted, clearly enjoying the attention. He explained to the class how he had tracked the creature for 2 days across the dunes, how he had worn it down through exhaustion and pressure until it had no strength left to resist, and how he had finally chained it while it was too weak to fight back. The class responded with murmurs of approval. On Threxa, and on many worlds like it, this was exactly the kind of story that earned respect. I clapped along with the others, though something about the Sandcrawler's darting eyes stayed with me longer than it should have. It did not look tamed. It looked exhausted and afraid and utterly without hope of escape. I told myself this was simply what control looked like. I told myself this many times that morning, though each time the thought felt a little less convincing than before. Elsie went next, leading her frosthound into the room on a heavy chain wrapped several times around its powerful neck. The creature moved low to the ground, ears flattened, teeth bared in a silent, constant snarl. Elsie described the 3 days she had spent tracking it through ice fields, the traps she had set, the moment she had finally cornered it against a frozen cliff with nowhere left to run. She spoke with pride about breaking its spirit through patience and pressure, about the exact moment she knew it had given up trying to fight her. The frosthound did not look at her once during the entire explanation. Its eyes stayed fixed on the floor, its body pressed as low as it could go, as if trying to make itself small enough to disappear entirely. One by one, the other students followed. Bastian arrived with a creature that hissed constantly from beneath a thick metal muzzle, its wings clipped so it could no longer take flight. A quiet girl named Freya brought a small but vicious burrowing creature, kept sedated inside a reinforced box, twitching occasionally as the drugs slowly wore thin. Every presentation followed the same pattern. A dangerous creature, captured through struggle, controlled through exhaustion or restraint, presented as proof of the student's strength and worthiness. I brought my stone serpent last among the early presentations, its massive coils wrapped in reinforced binding designed specifically to contain its crushing strength. I spoke about the 3 attempts it had taken me to finally corner it in the deep caverns beneath my home city, about the assistant I had needed to help subdue it, about the ancient stories my people told of this exact species and what it meant to bring one to heel. The class listened with genuine respect, and I felt the familiar warmth of pride swelling in my chest, the same warmth every other student in that room had felt when it was their turn to speak. And yet, even as I stood there accepting the approval of my classmates, I found myself glancing toward the door every few minutes, wondering where Alice was, wondering what she would bring, wondering if she would bring anything at all. She was not there. As the presentations continued, one after another, the empty seat where Alice usually sat became impossible to ignore. Students began to whisper among themselves. Dorian suggested loudly, without much concern in his voice, that the human girl had likely failed to find any creature at all and was too embarrassed to show her face in class. Elsie wondered aloud whether Alice had been hurt trying to capture something beyond her ability, whether humans were simply too fragile for an assignment like this. Bastian laughed and said perhaps she had finally realized she did not belong in a class meant for students who understood real strength. I said nothing during these conversations, though I noticed something strange happening inside myself as I listened to my classmates mock her absence. I did not feel the satisfaction I expected to feel. I felt something closer to worry, an uncomfortable, unfamiliar sensation that had no place inside a room built entirely around pride and conquest. Professor Holt called for order as the presentations neared their end, reminding the class that every student was expected to complete the assignment and that failure to do so would result in serious consequences for their standing at the academy. The professor's eyes moved briefly toward Alice's empty seat, and for just a moment, something flickered across their ancient, weathered face. Not disappointment, something closer to curiosity, as if even Professor Holt, who had seen 100 years of students, was wondering the same thing the rest of us were wondering. Where was she, and what would she bring? The final student before the break, a soft-spoken boy named Callum from a swamp world thick with poisonous mists, finished his presentation and led his creature back to its holding pen. The room settled into the low hum of conversation that always followed a long stretch of presentations, students comparing notes, comparing beasts, comparing bruises, earned in the process of proving their strength. It was in this moment of restless waiting that the doors finally opened. I remember the exact sound they made, a slow mechanical hiss followed by the heavy thud of metal locking into place along the frame. I remember how every head in the room turned at once, expecting to see the sandcrawler's grinding chains or the frosthound's low snarl repeated once again in some new form. What we saw instead made the entire hall fall completely silent. There were no chains, there was no cage, there were no assistants dragging some massive, struggling creature across the floor. There was only Alice, walking calmly through the doorway, her braids slightly loose from the walk, her expression as steady and quiet as it always was. And on her shoulders, curled peacefully against the sides of her neck, were 2 small creatures I recognized instantly, though recognizing them did nothing to help me understand what I was seeing. They were Cathrex cubs, a species so dangerous that most instructors refused to even bring specimens into the classroom for study. Adult Cathrex were known across a dozen systems for a simple, brutal reputation, killing any handler foolish enough to attempt taming them, no matter how skilled or well-armed that handler happened to be. Even as cubs, they were considered far too unpredictable and dangerous for casual contact. And yet here they were, resting against a human girl's shoulders, eyes closed, bodies loose and relaxed in a way that no captured creature in that room had shown all morning. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Professor Holt, who had surely witnessed centuries of strange and unexpected things during a long teaching career, stood frozen at the front of the hall, staring at the 2 small, sleeping predators draped across Alice's shoulders as if trying to convince themselves that what they were seeing was real. I felt my own breath catch somewhere in my throat, and beside me I heard Dorian mutter something under his breath that I could not quite make out, though the disbelief in his voice was unmistakable. Alice walked further into the room, her steps calm and unhurried, as though she had not just shattered every assumption the rest of us carried about strength, control, and what it truly meant to bring a beast to class. She stopped near the center of the hall, glanced around at the stunned faces staring back at her, and offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I am sorry I am late," she said. "They were sleeping, and I did not want to wake them." For a long moment, nobody in the training hall said anything at all. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system above us, a sound I had never noticed before in a room usually filled with chains rattling and beasts snarling and students boasting about their conquests. Then, all at once, the room erupted. Dorian was the first to find his voice, though what came out was less a sentence and more a kind of strangled disbelief. He took a half-step backward, his eyes fixed on the two small shapes resting against Alice's shoulders, and asked how she had gotten a Cathrex anywhere near her without being torn apart. Elsie's hand moved instinctively toward the restraint controls near her Frosthound's pen, as if some old instinct told her danger was standing in the middle of the room, even though the danger in question was sleeping peacefully and showed no sign of waking. Bastian laughed, a short, nervous sound with no real humor in it, and said this had to be some kind of trick, that no creature with Cathrex blood would ever allow itself to be carried like a child's toy unless it had been drugged into unconsciousness or was already close to death. Alice did not react to any of this the way I expected her to. She did not raise her voice, did not defend herself with the kind of proud, sharp words most of us would have used if our own methods had been questioned in front of the class. She simply stood there, patient, waiting for the noise to settle, one hand resting gently against the back of the smaller cub's neck, the way someone might rest a hand against a sleeping child to keep them calm. Professor Holt stepped forward from the front of the hall, moving slower than usual, studying Alice and the two cubs with an expression I had never seen on the old teacher's face before. It was not anger, and it was not simple curiosity either. It looked almost like fear, though fear of what exactly, I could not say. Perhaps fear of what this meant. Perhaps fear of how completely it broke every rule the professor had spent a century teaching. The professor asked, in a voice quieter than usual, how exactly Alice had managed to bring two Cathrex cubs into this room without restraints, without sedation, and without a single visible injury on her own body. Alice answered simply that she had not needed any of those things. Professor Holt's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion exactly, but with the sharp focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle they had never expected to encounter. The professor asked whether the cubs had been captured recently, and if so, how she had subdued them during the process. Alice shook her head and said she had not captured them at all. She said she had found them, weeks earlier, alone and starving in a remote stretch of forest, and that she had never once tried to subdue them in the way the assignment seemed to expect. This answer did nothing to calm the room. If anything, it made the confusion worse. Dorian demanded to know how she expected the class to believe that two Cathrex cubs, creatures known across multiple systems for turning on their own handlers within days of capture, had simply allowed a human girl to walk among them, hold them, and carry them into a room full of strangers without a single sign of aggression. I found myself studying the cubs more closely as the arguing continued around me. They were smaller than I expected, their fur a deep gray with faint silver markings along the spine, markings I recognized from textbooks describing the species as still developing, not yet full-grown, but already carrying the sharp claws and powerful jaw structure that made adult Cathrex so feared. Even asleep, there was something unmistakably dangerous about them, a coiled tension beneath the surface that suggested exactly how quickly gentle stillness could become something else entirely. And yet, they slept, undisturbed by the shouting around them, undisturbed by the tension thick enough to taste in the air, undisturbed by anything except the slow, steady rhythm of Alice's breathing beneath them. One of the cubs stirred slightly, nose twitching, and I felt my whole body tense, half expecting the room to descend into chaos the moment its eyes opened. But it simply shifted position, pressing closer against Alice's neck, and settled back into sleep, without so much as opening an eye. Elsie, who had grown quieter than the others during the argument, finally spoke up, her voice carrying none of Dorian's aggressive disbelief, but something closer to genuine, unsettled curiosity. She asked Alice directly whether she was afraid, standing there with two apex predators resting against her body in a room full of strangers. Alice considered the question for a moment before answering. She said she was not afraid, because fear was not something she had built into her relationship with the cubs from the very beginning. She said that from the first day she found them, she had made a choice not to treat them as something to be conquered, and that choice had shaped every single interaction that followed. Professor Holt asked, carefully, what exactly she meant by that. Before Alice could answer, Dorian interrupted again, his voice sharper now, edged with something that sounded almost like anger. He said this entire display was some kind of insult to the assignment, that the rest of the class had spent days tracking, fighting, and physically subduing dangerous creatures, risking real injury to prove their strength, while Alice apparently expected to receive the same credit simply by finding two orphaned cubs and letting them nap on her shoulders like household pets. The room murmured in agreement, and for the first time since Alice had walked through the door, I saw something flicker across her face that was not quite calm. It was not anger either. It looked more like patience being tested, the kind of expression someone wears when they have explained something important many times before and are preparing to explain it once again. She looked directly at Dorian and then at the rest of the room, before speaking. She said that everyone in this room had proven they were strong enough to force a wild creature into submission through exhaustion, fear, and physical dominance. She said she did not doubt that this took real courage and real skill, and she was not trying to diminish what any of them had accomplished. But she said that what she had done was different, not because it required less effort, but because it required a different kind of effort entirely. She said that anyone strong enough and patient enough could eventually force a wild animal to stop fighting back. But very few people ever tried to earn a wild animal's trust instead, because trust could not be forced, and it could not be rushed, and it offered no guarantee of success no matter how much time or care you invested. She said that when she found the cubs, they had already lost everything familiar to them. Their world had been torn apart in ways she was not yet ready to explain in full detail, and they had been left alone, hungry, and terrified in a place with no shelter and no protection. She said that if she had approached them the way the rest of the class had approached their own creatures, with rope, with force, with the assumption that dominance was the only way to gain control, she believed both cubs would have either fled into the wilderness and died there alone, or attacked her the moment she came close enough to try. Instead, she said, she had chosen to wait. Professor Holt, who had remained silent throughout this explanation, finally asked how long that waiting had taken and what exactly it had involved. Alice glanced down at the two sleeping shapes against her shoulders, her expression softening slightly, the tension of the last few minutes fading from her face, as she seemed to remember something private and important. She said it had taken weeks. She said there had been long days where the cubs would not come near her at all, where they hid at the edges of the forest and watched her from a distance, uncertain, wary, waiting to see whether she was another threat in a world that had already given them every reason to expect one. She said she had returned every single day regardless, bringing food, sitting quietly at a careful distance, never forcing herself closer than the cubs seemed willing to allow. She said that trust, when you build it instead of forcing it, moves at its own pace, and that pace cannot be rushed no matter how much you might want to rush it. She said there had been moments where she doubted the cubs would ever come close enough to let her touch them, moments where she wondered whether she had made the wrong choice by refusing to use the same methods everyone else in this room had used. But she said that eventually the cubs had approached her on their own, not because she had broken their will, and not because exhaustion had left them with no other choice, but because over time she had become something they associated with safety instead of danger. The room had grown quieter as she spoke, the earlier shouting replaced by something closer to stunned attention. Even Dorian, who moments earlier had been loudly dismissive, now stood watching her with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between skepticism and something that looked almost like discomfort, as if her words had touched a part of him he did not particularly want touched. Professor Holt studied Alice for a long moment, and then studied the two sleeping cubs against her shoulders, and then looked out across the room at the rest of us, standing beside our own chained and muzzled and sedated creatures. The professor asked a question then that none of us expected, a question that seemed to hang in the air long after it was spoken. The professor asked whether any of the creatures currently held in the pens along the wall would ever willingly choose to rest against the shoulders of the student who had captured them, undrugged, unchained, and unafraid. Nobody answered. I looked toward my own stone serpent, coiled tightly inside its reinforced binding, its ancient eyes fixed on nothing in particular, waiting out the hours until it could be returned to whatever holding facility the academy used between classes. I tried to imagine it resting calmly against my shoulders, the way the Cathrex cubs rested against Alice's, and the image would not form in my mind no matter how hard I tried to build it. I realized, standing there in that silent room, that despite everything I had been taught about strength since the day I was old enough to understand the concept, I had never once considered that there might be a different kind of victory available to me, a victory that did not require fear, or force, or the slow crushing of another creature's will. Alice's explanation was not finished. There was more to the story of how she had found the cubs, more about what had happened to their mother, more about choices that had nothing to do with strength in the way any of us understood the word. But that part of the story would have to wait, because Professor Holt, still watching her with that same unreadable expression, finally spoke again, asking her to begin from the very beginning and to leave nothing out. Alice found a low bench along the wall and sat down, careful not to disturb the two cubs still resting against her shoulders. The room settled around her, students slowly lowering themselves back into their seats, still watching her with a mixture of confusion and something none of us had a name for yet. Professor Holt remained standing near the front of the hall, arms folded, listening with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time to hear a story worth hearing. She began by explaining that weeks before the assignment was given, she had taken a solo research trip into one of the forest reserves near the academy, a place students were permitted to visit for independent study as long as they registered their travel in advance. She had gone there to study plant life for an entirely unrelated project, nothing to do with beasts or assignments or anything the rest of the class had been preparing for at the time. It was during that trip that she first heard the sound. She described it carefully, choosing her words the way someone does when they want to make sure they are understood exactly as they mean to be understood. She said it was a thin, high, broken sound, nothing like the confident calls of a healthy predator moving through its territory. It sounded, she said, like something in pain, or something afraid, or both at once. She followed the sound through the trees, moving carefully, aware that whatever was making that noise might not welcome a stranger nearby. What she found, tucked beneath the exposed roots of a fallen tree, were the two cubs, pressed close together, thin from hunger, and utterly alone. Nearby, she said, though she paused before continuing, was what remained of their mother. The room went very still at this. I noticed several students shift uncomfortably in their seats, and even Dorian, who had spent the entire morning eager to argue, said nothing at all. Alice explained, carefully and without unnecessary detail, that the mother Cathrex had been killed by hunters, poachers who had entered the reserve illegally, seeking to capture or kill adult Cathrex for their fur, which was considered valuable on several black markets across the sector. The hunters, she said, had taken what they wanted and left without noticing, or without caring, that two cubs had survived, hidden beneath the roots where their mother had likely pushed them in her final moments, trying to keep them safe. Professor Holt's expression darkened slightly at this detail, and I remembered, with a strange twist of discomfort, that poaching operations targeting protected species were not unheard of near several of the systems represented in this very classroom. I did not know, and would likely never know, whether anyone connected to that particular crime sat among us, but the thought settled uneasily in my chest regardless. Alice continued, explaining that she had known immediately she could not simply leave the cubs there. She said she also knew, just as immediately, that she was not equipped, trained, or authorized to remove 2 Cathrex cubs from a protected reserve and claim them as some kind of exotic pet. She said the correct action, according to every rule she had been taught, would have been to report the sighting to reserve authorities and let trained wildlife officers handle the situation from there. She said she did report it, but she also said that she could not simply walk away in the meantime, not while 2 starving, terrified cubs remained alone in the place where their mother had died protecting them. So she began returning every day. At first, she said, she kept her distance, sitting quietly at the edge of a small clearing near the fallen tree, far enough away that the cubs did not feel cornered, close enough that they could see her if they chose to look. She brought food each time, simple offerings left at a careful distance, never forced into their space, never pushed toward them in a way that might feel like a threat. For the first several days, the cubs would not approach at all. They stayed hidden beneath the roots, watching her from the shadows, sometimes disappearing entirely for hours before returning once she had gone quiet and still. She said there were nights she left that clearing uncertain whether she had made any progress at all, uncertain whether the cubs would survive long enough for reserve officials to relocate them to proper care, uncertain whether her presence was helping or simply prolonging something that could not be fixed through patience alone. But she kept returning. She described, in quiet detail, the small changes she began to notice over time. The food she left began disappearing while she watched from a distance, rather than only after she had gone. The cubs began emerging from beneath the roots earlier in her visits, watching her with less obvious tension in their small bodies. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after she first found them, the smaller cub crept close enough to sniff at the edge of her boot before darting back to safety. She said that moment mattered more to her than she could easily explain, not because the cub had done anything remarkable by human standards, but because it represented a choice. The cub had chosen, on its own, without force or fear, to close a small piece of the distance between them. From that point forward, she said, progress came more steadily, though never quickly, and never in a straight line. Some days the cubs seemed eager to approach her. Other days they retreated back into caution, as if some old instinct reminded them that trust was dangerous and safety could not be assumed. She said she learned, slowly, to let them set the pace entirely, resisting every instinct that told her to move faster, to push harder, to try to speed along a process that could not be rushed without undoing everything already built. Professor Holt interrupted at this point, asking a question I suspected many of us were wondering ourselves. The professor asked whether Alice had ever felt she was in danger during this process, given that even young Cathrex carried enough strength in their jaws to cause serious injury. Alice considered the question honestly before answering. She said there had been moments of uncertainty, moments where the cub's natural instincts flared into something sharper, a warning growl, a defensive posture, teeth bared in a way that reminded her exactly what kind of creature she was dealing with. She said she had learned to recognize those moments and to give the cubs space when they needed it, rather than treating every display of caution as something to be forced through or punished. She said the difference, in her mind, was simple. She was not trying to convince the cubs that fighting her was pointless. She was trying to show them, patiently and consistently, that she was never going to be a threat in the first place. Those were very different goals, she said, and they required very different methods to achieve. Eventually, she explained, the reserve officials she had originally contacted returned to assess the situation. They found 2 cubs in far better condition than expected, already showing early signs of trust toward a human who had, by all official rules, no business forming that kind of bond with a protected predator species. The officials debated what to do, given that relocating the cubs to a distant sanctuary might mean starting the entire trust-building process over from nothing, this time with strangers, at a facility far from everything the cubs had begun to feel safe around. In the end, she said, an unusual exception was granted. Given the cubs' fragile condition and the clear bond already forming, Officials agreed to allow continued supervised contact under specific conditions, provided Alice remained in close communication with reserve staff and followed strict guidelines meant to protect both her safety and the long-term well-being of the cubs. That arrangement, she said, was still in effect. She was not keeping the cubs as pets, and she made that distinction carefully, aware of how easily her story could be misunderstood. She was, for now, serving as a trusted caretaker during a critical period of their early development, working alongside reserve officials rather than around them, while long-term plans for the cubs' future were carefully considered. When the assignment was given days earlier, she said, she had thought long and hard about what it truly meant to bring a beast for class and demonstrate control. She had watched her classmates prepare for days to capture creatures through struggle and force, and she had asked herself whether that was the only definition of control worth demonstrating. She decided it was not. She said she brought the cubs today not because they were tamed in the way the rest of the class understood taming, but because they trusted her enough to remain calm in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by unfamiliar creatures, without needing chains or sedation or fear to keep them still. She said that trust, freely given rather than forced, was its own kind of control, quieter than the kind demonstrated earlier that morning, but no less real. The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. I found myself looking again at the stone serpent coiled beside me, its ancient eyes distant and hollow, and for the first time since capturing it, I felt something uncomfortable settle in my chest. Not regret exactly, something closer to a question I had never thought to ask myself before. Professor Holt studied Alice for a long, quiet moment, and then looked slowly around the room, at every chained and muzzled and sedated creature held along the wall, before finally speaking again. The professor said this was, without question, the most unusual response to this assignment in the Academy's long history. And then the professor asked one final question, directed not only at Alice, but at every student sitting in that room. The professor asked which kind of control, in the end, truly proved the greater strength. Nobody answered the professor's question right away. It hung in the air the way certain questions do, too large to answer quickly, too uncomfortable to answer honestly without admitting something you had never wanted to admit about yourself. Dorian was the first to break the silence, though his voice had lost most of the sharp confidence it carried earlier that morning. He said that what Alice had done was impressive, he could not deny that much, but he still believed that patience alone would never work on every creature. He said some beasts, especially the truly dangerous ones from the harshest worlds, would never respond to gentleness no matter how much time you gave them. He said force existed for a reason, because some situations demanded it, and no amount of quiet patience could replace it when survival was on the line. Professor Holt considered this for a moment before responding. The professor agreed that force was sometimes necessary, particularly in situations of immediate danger, where there was no time to build trust slowly. But the professor added that necessity was different from preference, and that most of the students in this room had chosen force not because gentler methods were unavailable, but because force was faster, simpler, and more familiar. The professor suggested that perhaps the true lesson of this assignment was not that one method was always correct, but that every student needed to understand there was more than one method worth knowing. Elsie spoke next, quieter than before, her earlier defensiveness replaced with something more thoughtful. She admitted that watching her frosthound refuse to meet her eyes during her own presentation had bothered her more than she wanted to admit at the time, though she had pushed the feeling aside because it did not match what she had been taught to expect from a successful demonstration. She said that seeing the Cathrex cubs sleep peacefully against Alice's shoulders made her wonder whether her own creature's submission had ever truly meant anything beyond exhaustion and fear. I found myself speaking before I fully decided to, surprising even myself with how easily the words came. I said that on Threxa, we are taught from childhood that strength is proven only through dominance, that a creature's fear is the clearest evidence of a person's worth. I said I had never once questioned this belief until today, and that watching Alice's cubs rest so calmly beside her made me wonder whether we had simply never bothered to imagine an alternative. Alice listened to each of these responses without interrupting, her hand still resting gently against the smaller cub's back. When the room quieted again, she added one more thought of her own, offered carefully, without any hint of pride or superiority in her voice. She said she did not believe her way was the only right way, or even the best way in every situation. She said there were absolutely times when quick, decisive force was the only responsible choice, especially when lives were in immediate danger, and there was no time to wait for trust to slowly develop. She said her point was never that patience should replace strength entirely, only that patience deserved to be recognized as its own form of strength, rather than dismissed as weakness simply because it looked different from what we were used to seeing. Professor Holt nodded slowly at this, and something in the old teacher's posture seemed to relax, as if a lesson long buried beneath a century of tradition had finally found its way to the surface of this particular class, at this particular moment, through this particular assignment. The professor turned to address the entire room, raising a hand for full attention. The professor said that every student present had technically fulfilled the requirements of the assignment, each in their own way, according to the methods their own worlds had taught them to value. But the professor added that true mastery of survival studies required more than the ability to dominate a dangerous creature through force. It required understanding, adaptability, and the wisdom to recognize when a different approach might succeed where force alone would fail. The professor said that in 100 years of teaching this course, no student had ever demonstrated that lesson as clearly as Alice had that morning, and that her presentation would be remembered as a turning point in how this assignment was explained to future classes. As the professor spoke, the smaller of the two cubs finally stirred, lifting its head slightly, blinking sleepy eyes at the unfamiliar room around it. For a moment, I felt the whole class tense, waiting to see what would happen now that one of the sleeping predators had finally woken among us. But the cub simply yawned, stretched its small clawed paws against Alice's shoulder, and nuzzled closer against her neck, utterly unbothered by the dozens of unfamiliar faces watching it. Alice smiled softly, murmuring something quiet to the cub that none of us could hear clearly, and the small creature settled again, content, safe, entirely unafraid. The second cub woke shortly after, mirroring its siblings' calm curiosity, glancing briefly around the room before deciding there was nothing here worth worrying about, and returning its attention to the steady, familiar warmth of the person carrying it. I watched this unfold with something I had never expected to feel toward a Cathrex, a species every Threxan child was taught to fear from the earliest age. I did not feel fear watching those two cubs wake in a room full of strangers. I felt something closer to quiet wonder, the same feeling I imagined explorers must feel when they discover something in the universe that does not fit any of the maps they were given as children. Professor Holt dismissed the class shortly after, though the usual rush toward the door was noticeably absent that day. Students lingered instead, some approaching Alice cautiously to ask quiet questions about the cubs, others simply standing back, watching, still processing everything they had witnessed that morning. Even Dorian, after a long hesitation, approached and asked, in a much softer tone than he had used all day, whether the cubs would ever be comfortable enough to be touched by someone other than her. Alice said that with enough patience and enough time, almost anything was possible. She said trust could be built with more than one person, as long as that person was willing to move at the pace the creature required, rather than the pace the person preferred. She said Dorian was welcome to visit, slowly, carefully, if he was genuinely interested in learning, rather than simply proving something to himself or to the rest of the class. Dorian nodded, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked less like a boy eager to prove his strength, and more like someone quietly reconsidering everything he thought he understood about what strength actually meant. I stayed behind after most of the others had gone, watching Alice gather her things carefully, the two cubs still draped comfortably across her shoulders as she prepared to return them to whatever quiet space she kept for them between visits. I found myself asking her, somewhat hesitantly, whether she had known from the very beginning how differently her approach would be received by the rest of the class. She considered the question honestly before answering. She said she had expected confusion, and perhaps some disapproval, given how differently her method looked compared to everyone else's. but she said she had decided long before the assignment that she would rather demonstrate something honest about what she believed than perform something impressive simply because it matched everyone else's expectations. I asked her, finally, why she had chosen to answer Professor Holt's question the way she did on that very first day, weeks earlier, when she asked whether the creature had to be afraid of her. She smiled slightly, adjusting the smaller cub's position against her shoulder as it settled back toward sleep. She said that somewhere along the way, she had come to believe that fear and respect, while they might sometimes overlap, were never truly the same thing. She said fear could force a creature to stop fighting you, but only trust could make a creature choose to stay beside you when it had every opportunity to leave. I walked with her partway back toward the dormitories that evening, saying very little, thinking a great deal. My own stone serpent had been returned to its holding facility by then, coiled tightly within reinforced walls, waiting silently for whatever the academy planned to do with it once the assignment had been fully graded. I found myself wondering, for the first time since capturing it, whether there might have been another way, a slower, harder, less certain way that could have led to something different than fear pressed down beneath heavy chains. I did not have an answer that night. I am not certain I have a complete answer even now, months later, as I think back on everything that happened in that training hall. But I remember, clearly, the image of those two small cubs sleeping peacefully against Alice's shoulders, undisturbed by chains, undisturbed by fear, undisturbed by anything except the simple, quiet certainty that they were safe. And I remember thinking, as I watched them disappear down the corridor beside her, that perhaps the greatest strength any of us could ever hope to demonstrate was not the ability to make something powerful bow beneath us. Perhaps it was the patience to earn something powerful's trust instead, and the humility to understand that the second kind of strength was, in every way that truly mattered, the harder one to achieve.